that you're rotating on your
I also wanted to
hands
talk
off.
specifically how many of our ICE agents have been docked.
On the ground. On the ground. Hands behind your back. Hands behind your back.
If you let my hands go and stand behind my back.
All right, cool.
Other hand. Lay flat. Lay flat.
Other hand, sir. Other hand.
There's no recording allowed out here.
I do not know.
There's no recording allowed out here per FBI rights for the building.
So what, I'm sorry?
There's no recording allowed out here.
That's my boss. I have to
There's no
record
recording
everything
allowed
for
out
us.
here. You can record. There's no recording allowed out here.
I'm not a member
There's
of
no
this.
recording allowed.
I understand that, sir.
On June 12, 2025, the city of Los Angeles became the epicenter of a shocking political moment. U.S. Senator Alex Padilla, a Democratic representative from California, was forcibly removed and handcuffed during a press conference held by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. This incident occurred amidst an atmosphere already charged with political tension, as the Trump administration's controversial immigration policies had sparked widespread protests and public outcry. Padilla's attempt to ask a simple question about recent immigration raids was met with a shocking response. As he tried to engage Noem, he was abruptly interrupted by security personnel.
Exaggerate and embellishing. Sir, hands up, hands up. I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your
I also wanted to
hands
talk
off.
specifically.
Despite Padilla identifying himself as a U.S. senator, federal agents refused to acknowledge his status. They pushed him to the ground and handcuffed him, in a moment that seemed to disregard the respect typically afforded to elected officials. The scene, which was captured on video, went viral in a matter of minutes. The nation watched as Padilla, a member of the U.S. Senate,
How many of our ICE agents have been docked.
On the ground. On the ground. Hands behind your back. Hands behind your back.
If you let my hands go and stand behind my back.
All right.
was forcibly removed by federal agents in what many saw as a disturbing overreach of authority. Padilla had been attending the press conference to ask Noem about the federal government's immigration enforcement policies. Tensions had already been high in Los Angeles due to a series of immigration raids carried out by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. These raids had led to hundreds of arrests and had left many in the immigrant community feeling vulnerable and fearful. Padilla,
Cool. Other hand. Lay flat. Lay flat.
Other hand, sir. Other hand.
There's no recording allowed out here.
I do not know.
There's no recording allowed out here per FBI rights for the building.
So what, I'm sorry?
There's no recording allowed out here.
That's my boss. I have to
There's no
record
recording
everything
allowed
for
out
us.
here. You can record. There's no recording allowed out here.
I'm not a member
There's
of
no
this.
recording allowed out
I
here.
understand that, sir.
who had been a vocal critic of the Trump administration's hardline stance on immigration, took the opportunity to question Noem about the effects of these raids. His goal was to draw attention to the human cost of these policies, but instead, he became the center of an entirely different controversy. What followed was an intense wave of criticism from various political leaders and commentators. Senator Padilla's removal from the press conference raised serious questions about the limits of federal power and the treatment of elected officials. The response from federal agents, including members of the FBI and Secret Service, was seen by many as an attempt to silence a sitting senator who was simply doing his job. The fact that Padilla was not allowed to ask a question during a press conference, a setting meant for public discourse, left many wondering what kind of message this incident was sending. In the wake of the incident, protests erupted across Los Angeles and other cities, with demonstrators rallying against the ongoing immigration raids and the federal government's handling of immigrant issues. These protests, which had already been gaining momentum since June 6, 2025, reached a boiling point following Padilla's arrest. Thousands took to the streets, voicing their anger over the treatment of immigrants and the perceived overreach of federal authority. As the protests grew, so did the confrontations with law enforcement, resulting in several arrests and clashes. The protests were not just about the raids, but also about the broader political climate in the United States. They were a response to a sense of frustration and fear that had been growing in many communities, particularly among immigrant families. The Los Angeles protests became emblematic of a larger national conversation about immigration, civil rights, and the balance of power between federal and state governments. In a dramatic twist, President Trump ordered the deployment of National Guard troops to Los Angeles in response to the unrest. The president invoked Title 10 of the U.S. Code, a rarely used legal provision that allows the president to send federal troops into a state without the consent of the state's governor. This move was widely criticized by California officials, including Governor Gavin Newsom, who saw it as an unwarranted federal overreach. Newsom expressed his dismay at the decision, calling it an attempt to intimidate the people of California and undermine state sovereignty. The presence of federal troops only added fuel to the fire, and the protests in Los Angeles became a symbol of the growing divide between the federal government and state leadership. For many, the deployment of federal troops to a major U.S. city felt like an extreme response to what had been primarily a series of peaceful demonstrations. It raised the question of how far the government could go in suppressing dissent before it crossed a line. The actions taken by federal authorities seemed to be an attempt to stifle opposition, to silence those who were calling attention to the struggles faced by immigrant communities. The events of June 12th were not just about one senator being removed from a press conference. They were a reflection of the larger, more troubling trend of government overreach and the erosion of democratic norms. In the days that followed, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle weighed in on the incident. Some, like Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, condemned the actions of the federal agents, calling the removal of Padilla an attack on free speech and the rights of elected officials. Others, particularly Republicans, defended the actions of the federal agents, arguing that Padilla had been disruptive and that the security personnel had acted within their rights. Rift in the country, particularly when it came to issues of immigration and the role of the federal government. As the protests grew, so did the attention being paid to the issue of immigration. Padilla's arrest became a rallying cry for those who felt that the federal government was ignoring the humanity of immigrants. His forcible removal from the press conference brought the issue into the national spotlight.
Since the beginning of the year, but especially over the course of recent weeks, several of my colleagues, have been asking the Department of Homeland Security for more information and more answers on their increasingly extreme immigration enforcement actions. And we've gotten little to no information in response to our inquiries. And so I came to the press conference to hear what she had to say, to see if I could learn any new additional information. And at one point, I had a question. And let me emphasize, just as we've emphasized the right for people to peacefully protest and to stand up for their First Amendment rights, for our fundamental rights. I was there peacefully. At one point, I had a question. And so I began to ask a question. I was almost immediately forcibly removed from the room. I was forced to the ground, and I was handcuffed. I was not arrested. I was not detained. I will say this. If this is how this administration responds to a senator with a question, if this is how the Department of Homeland Security responds to a senator with a question, you can only imagine what they're doing to farm workers, to cooks, to day laborers out in the Los Angeles community and throughout California and throughout the country. We will hold this administration accountable.
And more people began to pay attention to the consequences of the administration's policies. The protests were no longer just about the raids. They were about the way immigrants were being treated in this country, about the way people were being criminalized simply for trying to make a better life for themselves. Padilla, for his part, spoke out about the incident, condemning the actions of federal agents and expressing his frustration at the way he had been treated. He made it clear that his goal was not just to ask a question, but to stand up for the people who were being affected by these policies. For Padilla, the arrest was a reminder of the lengths to which the federal government was willing to go to silence dissent. He vowed to continue fighting for the rights of immigrants and to push for a more humane immigration system.